In the 78th minute of a group stage match in Dallas, the referee did something that used to be unthinkable at a World Cup. He stopped the game. Not for an injury. Not for a foul. He stopped it because the air itself had become dangerous for the 22 men on the pitch. Players did not run to the touchline. They walked. Some poured bottles of water over their heads. One of them sat down on the grass and simply stared at nothing. And the most unsettling part of that scene was not that it happened. It was that FIFA had been warned it would happen, in writing, by the very people who play the game, months in advance, and had been told exactly how to prevent it. You were told this would be the most professional World Cup ever staged. The biggest. The safest. 16 gleaming stadiums across 3 countries, a tournament so large it needed an entire continent to hold it. That was the promise. What you were not told is that a significant number of those matches were scheduled to be played in conditions that doctors, scientists, and the players themselves had formally described as a health risk. This is the story of how the 2026 World Cup quietly became a test of survival, and how the warnings that could have prevented it were sitting on FIFA's desk long before a single ball was kicked. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand what happened before the tournament even began. On the 13th of May, 2026, 21 experts in climate and human health sent a formal letter to FIFA. These were not activists shouting from the outside. They were specialists in exactly the thing FIFA was about to gamble with, the limits of the human body under extreme heat. Their message was direct. Lower the threshold. Change the rules that decide when it is too dangerous to play. They asked FIFA to adopt a stricter standard for something called the wet bulb globe temperature, a measurement that combines heat and humidity into a single number that tells you how hard it is for the body to cool itself down. When that number climbs past 28 degrees, the human body starts losing its ability to shed heat through sweat. And at that point, 90 minutes of elite football stops being a sporting contest and starts becoming something closer to a medical experiment. Then came the players. 60 current and former professional footballers signed their own open letter, urging FIFA to update its heat guidelines before the tournament. 60. Think about what that means. The people whose entire livelihood depends on this competition, the people who would never willingly damage the sport that made them, looked at the schedule and decided the risk was serious enough to put their names on paper and send it to the most powerful body in football. That is not a complaint about comfort. That is a warning from the workforce. And here is the number that turns those warnings from theory into something concrete. Analysts estimated that around 26 of the 104 matches at this World Cup could be played in conditions reaching at least 26 degrees on the wet bulb globe temperature index. 5 of those games were expected to hit 28 degrees or higher, the exact level the scientists had circled in red. Roughly 1 in 4 matches at the biggest football tournament on Earth carried a genuine heat risk. 14 of the 16 stadiums could, at some point, cross into dangerous territory. This was not bad luck. It was printed in the forecast before the tournament started. But what does that number actually do to a person? When the wet bulb globe temperature climbs past 28 degrees, the body's main cooling system starts to fail. Sweat only cools you if it can evaporate, and in high humidity it cannot. So the sweat pours off the skin without taking the heat with it. The core temperature climbs. The heart races faster to push blood to the surface, trying to dump heat that has nowhere to go. Reactions slow. Judgment blurs. The muscles, starved of the oxygen now being diverted to cooling, start to cramp and fail. This is the invisible opponent the schedule quietly signed the players up to face, and it is an opponent that has, in other sports and other summers, put athletes in hospital and worse. To see what that actually feels like, you do not need to imagine it. You can listen to a player who lived it. During the Club World Cup held in the United States the previous summer, a dress rehearsal for everything that was coming, Argentina's Enzo Fernandez described feeling dizzy on the pitch. He called the temperatures very dangerous. This is a world-class athlete, one of the fittest human beings on the planet, telling the world that the conditions had pushed his body to the edge of what it could handle. And he was not alone. Across that Club World Cup, teams complained openly about afternoon kickoffs, coaches cut training sessions short, and matches slowed to a crawl in the second half as legs simply gave out. That tournament was supposed to be the trial run, the chance to spot the danger and fix it. The danger was spotted. It was written about, spoken about, warned about. And then the exact same kickoff pattern was carried straight into the World Cup itself. So why were these matches scheduled at the hottest hours of the day in the first place? Here is where the story gets uncomfortable, because the answer has almost nothing to do with football and almost everything to do with television. Europe is the single largest market for World Cup broadcasting. Europe is also 6 to 9 hours ahead of North America. For a match to land in the European primetime evening, when the largest possible audience is sitting at home, it has to kick off in the early afternoon in Dallas, in Houston, in Miami, in Monterrey. And the early afternoon in those cities, in June and July, is precisely when the sun is most punishing. The kickoff times were not chosen for the players on the pitch. They were chosen for the viewers on the sofa, and for the broadcasting money those viewers represent. Now, before this becomes a one-sided story, it is only fair to give FIFA its due, because they did respond. For this tournament, FIFA introduced mandatory hydration breaks, 3 minutes in each half of every single match. And this genuinely was new. In the past, water breaks were only called in extreme heat, at the referee's discretion. This time they were guaranteed across all 104 games, regardless of the weather, regardless of the stadium. FIFA also spoke of cooling infrastructure for players and fans, adapted work-to-rest cycles, and enhanced medical readiness that would scale up as real conditions demanded. On paper, this was the most heat-conscious World Cup FIFA had ever organized. That is a real point, and it deserves to be said plainly. But here is where the goodwill runs into reality. Because the moment those hydration breaks appeared on screen, something else appeared with them. Advertising. Broadcasters, sitting on hundreds of newly created gaps in the action, filled a number of those cooling breaks with commercials. And so the very pause that was meant to protect a player's body from collapse doubled, conveniently, as a fresh revenue stream. Fans noticed immediately. A measure sold as pure player welfare had a second life as a sponsor's dream. And once people saw that, a harder question followed. Were these breaks really about protecting players? Or were they also about opening more doors for money? When a safety measure and a profit opportunity line up that perfectly, people are right to ask which one was really driving the decision. And here is where the story turns, because the heat did not fall evenly across this tournament. It hunted specific cities. In Dallas and Arlington, in Houston, in Miami, the combination of raw temperature and thick humidity created some of the most punishing football conditions anywhere on the planet. In Monterrey, just across the Mexican border, the afternoon sun turned the pitch into a furnace. And then there was Mexico City, where a different danger waited, altitude stacked on top of heat, thin air that leaves the lungs gasping even before the sun is factored in. Each of these venues had been studied. Each carried a forecast. And the matches were slotted into them anyway, at the times that suited a television grid an ocean away rather than the athletes who would have to survive them. The map of this World Cup was, in places, a map of exactly where not to ask a human being to run for 90 minutes in the early afternoon. There was also the matter of the water itself. In the lead up to the tournament, FIFA announced a ban on reusable water bottles inside all stadiums, citing safety. Think about the timing of that. A ban on fans bringing their own water into venues where matches would be played during the hottest hours of the day, in some of the hottest cities in North America. The backlash was immediate and obvious, and eventually FIFA clarified that fans in the United States and Canada could bring in factory-sealed plastic bottles. But the fact that the instinct, in the middle of a heat crisis, was first to restrict water access told its own quiet story about whose comfort was being prioritized. If all of this feels strangely familiar, that is because we have been here before. Rewind to 1994, the last time the United States hosted a World Cup. Back then, too, matches were pushed into the blazing midday sun so that European television could show them in the evening. Players in cities like Orlando ran themselves into the ground under temperatures that pushed well past anything comfortable. Go back even further, to Mexico in 1986, and you find the same pattern: noon kickoffs under a brutal sun and thin mountain air, again shaped by the demands of European broadcasters. The heat problem at a World Cup is not some new accident of climate. It is a decades-old decision that keeps being made the same way, because the money keeps pointing in the same direction. What has changed is that the summers are hotter now, the science is sharper, and the players finally decided to speak. There is one image from 1994 that footballers of a certain age still talk about. Grown men, some of the best in the world, walking at the final whistle because they had nothing left to give, their bodies wrung out by a sun that had no business hosting a football match at that hour. The football that summer was slower, more cautious, more afraid of the heat than of the opponent. Coaches learned to hold something back, to protect their players from the conditions rather than chase the game. And the lesson from that tournament was obvious to anyone paying attention. Heat does not just endanger players. It quietly strangles the very spectacle the broadcasters are paying for. The irony writes itself. The pursuit of a bigger television audience produces the exact conditions that make the football on that television worse to watch. And this is the part that should stay with you, the human weight underneath all the numbers. Picture a defender in the 80th minute of a match in Houston, his legs gone, his vision swimming, his shirt soaked through, being asked to sprint back and cover a counterattack in air that his own body can barely process. Picture the physio on the sideline, watching the medical readings climb, knowing the schedule will not bend for anyone. Picture a family in the stands, who saved for a year to be there, sitting in metal seats under a sun with no shade, told they could not even bring their own water in. These are not abstractions. These are the people the schedule was built around, and yet somehow they were the last to be considered. Now picture the young player who waited his whole life for this, a debutant handed the biggest afternoon of his career, and instead of being asked to produce the football of his dreams, he is asked to simply endure, to survive the 90 minutes rather than shine across them. A World Cup is supposed to be the stage where careers are made. For some of these players, in some of these cities, it risked becoming the stage where their bodies were pushed past the line that no medal is worth crossing. FIFA, for its part, has insisted that its heat planning was thorough, that its cooling measures were real, that medical readiness would scale to the conditions on the day. And in fairness, some of that is true. But planning to manage a danger is not the same as choosing to avoid it. The scientists did not ask FIFA to hand out more water. They asked FIFA to move the kickoff times. And that single request, the one thing that would have actually solved the problem at its root, was the one thing the broadcasting deals would not allow. Everything else, the breaks, the bottles, the cooling zones, was treatment for a wound that never needed to be opened. So strip away the branding and the spectacle, and what you are left with is a simple, uncomfortable truth. This was sold to the world as the safest, most advanced World Cup ever built. But the people who play the game, and the scientists who study the body, looked at the plan and warned that a quarter of the matches carried a real risk to the players' health. They offered a solution. The solution collided with television money. And television money, as it so often does in modern football, won. Which leaves the questions that really matter, and I would genuinely like to hear where you land on them. Should the comfort of a viewer thousands of miles away ever outweigh the safety of the athlete on the pitch? If 60 players and 21 scientists warn you in writing, and you carry on anyway, is that planning, or is that gambling with people who trusted you? And how many warnings does a governing body get to ignore before we stop calling it an accident? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and the honest ones always sharpen the story. If this gave you a way of seeing the tournament you did not have before, consider following along for the rest of it. Because football at this scale is never just a tournament. It's a moment in time.